You mentioned that am I right? The main figure of this opera Awakening is Rebecca Cox Jackson.
That's right.
Tell me about how you arrived at Rebecca Cox Jackson, and how does this? I mean, I won't hold you to it because we're not done yet. But how's it developing that it's about her?
Yeah, so this goes back even further. I did a postdoc at Princeton University. I was in the African American Studies department, and I worked on a lot of works then. I had a lot of time to think then. I remember that. I I was working on different things. Part of the research I was doing was on Alice Coltrane, and I spent time at the ashram that she had, Sai Anantam Ashram in Agora Hills, California. Since then, the ashram closed, and also the fires that came, a lot was destroyed where the ashram was. But I feel very blessed that I had a chance to go there, and I visited with Radha Batafasina Reyes, who's there, and I was introduced to her by Brandy Younger. And Charlotte Brathwaite, the director I'm working with on the opera, we went to the ashram together in 2014. And then in 2015, I went and spent a couple of weeks there. So those 2 years I was at Princeton, and I was talking with the historian Tara Hunter, who's professor of history at Princeton. And she knew of my fascination for Alice Coltrane and also my interest in Harriet Tubman as a big inspiration in a lot of my work. And so I asked her, did she advise any other Black women from that time period of Harriet Tubman that maybe would be of interest to me? And she said right away, Rebecca Cox Jackson. She knew I'd be interested in her for those two reasons. So back then, that's when I learned about her, and I read some about her and how she's a free Black person, was born in the late 18th century, and she was born in Philadelphia, your hometown.
Right.
So she was born in Philadelphia, and her brother was an important leader in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She was very involved with that, but she made this decision when she had a spiritual awakening to leave her family and to go upstate New York and join a Shaker community. And then from there, she and Rebecca Perot, another Rebecca, they were known as the two Rebeccas during the time. They moved back to Philadelphia and started a Black Shaker community. So that's what I knew about her. But also during this time period, Colleen Smith and I actually linked up at the ashram too, at Alice Coltrane's ashram.
Okay.
When I was staying there the second year, I already knew of Colleen Smith because one of the earlier projects I did with Charlotte, some of Colleen's artwork was a big part of that piece that we did called Prophetica in the oratorio. It just was a coincidence that we both passed through Alice Coltrane's ashram at the same time. And so we spent time there together. And also Arthur Jaffa came through, great filmmaker. So I just had this great time just getting to talk with them. But I learned that after that, Colleen Smith, that she was also fascinated with Rebecca Cox Jackson and had been doing research on her and did a film that included some inspiration of Rebecca Cox Jackson as well as Alice Coltrane. So these connections, they've just been kind of circulating, and so that's how I would say I came to her. But now we've all been reading, like Sharon Strange, the poet. We've all been reading the book together. There's this book on her, and I can give you the title later. I have it over there. But the book on Rebecca Cox Jackson and Sharon. When we worked on a piece earlier with that we wrote with and for Helga Davis. Sharon drew a lot of inspiration from Sandra Bland's words. This piece was about Sandra Bland, and so Yet Unheard. And so in this opera, it's the same kind of process where we're looking at the actual words that Rebecca Cox Jackson left behind, and Sharon is drawing some inspiration from that. But yeah, so we're at the point where we're still like dreaming big about all the different things that are possible with this opera, as well as the process, because we want our process to not just be a private process. Some parts of it will be private and some parts will be public along the way. And so we're deciding what that'll be, and also how these events can also be helpful in a very tangible way with the movement that's going on, where we're trying to, where people are really, for everything that's going on right now.
Since you brought up Alice Coltrane, I would love to talk with you about her and her music and her impact, because when when you performed with us at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is now a little over 3 years ago. You and Brandy Younger came and brought us a program around the music of Alice Coltrane. Not only that music, but it sort of sprung from the music of Alice Coltrane and some of your own compositions. Can you remind me or tell me about your connection to Alice Coltrane's music? How did that come to you? And I think you use the word obsession or passion. Where's Alice Coltrane in your worldview of music, and how does it inform your work?
Yeah, so I can go way back, like when I was a child, when I was studying at the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts in New Orleans. I remember, and also there was when I was studying with, I learned about John Coltrane, and John Coltrane has been a large influence on me ever since. Like, I think the first Coltrane I heard was A Love Supreme, and then I heard some of the earlier works later, and then the later works as well. But I've always been inspired by John Coltrane, and people would mention Alice Coltrane to me, and I heard her in his later recordings, but I didn't know about her music until much later. Like, I knew about her as a pianist with John Coltrane and had a lot of admiration for her in that setting. It's just that it blew my mind when I learned about all of the work that she did later. Right. And so that came later. So when I moved to the East Coast, I was, before I went to Columbia, I was at Rutgers. I was studying with Stanley Cowell. And I used to spend a lot of time in New York playing music and meeting people. And one of the people I met early on was Brandy. Friends of ours introduced. I think it was Sean Jones. It was Sean Jones and Jerome Jennings. They're like, y'all need to meet each other. Like, y'all are kind of like the same person, but not really. That's what they kept saying. So we actually met. I went to some of her events, and I was just amazed to meet this wonderful harpist who was playing, like, you know, all the different styles that Brandy plays. And so we met, and we actually were friends before we started collaborating. I would go to her shows, and she came to some of mine, and sometimes she'd guest in a show I was doing, or she'd have me guest in hers. And then we started finally just like planning some events together. And during that time, I learned more about Alice Coltrane from Brandy, and also a book came out I think it was 2010. I know I was at Columbia, and the Jazz Studies Center, they invited Frania Berkman, who was a musicologist who wrote about Alice Coltrane, and was the first person to write about her in that sort of way, like in a detailed scholarly format. And it just changed everything. I went to the book talk. I got the book. I told Frania Berkman how much the discussion of like her talking about writing the scholarly work and writing about spiritual, all the things she had to do across fields to write about someone like Alice Coltrane. Like, it's writing about music, but it's also religion. It's like feminist studies. It's like all these women's studies. It's like all these things that go into it. But I spoke with her then, and I had planned to keep in touch with her, but she actually passed away soon after that. So that was really sad. But we had this book, and I remember us reading around the same time, me and Brandy and some other folks who, we were all kind of in this Alice Coltrane thing. So ever since then, it's just been like a fascination, and I've just been listening to a lot of her. I started hearing some of her works that she made when she was at the ashram, and that music has been not only interesting for me intellectually, it was on that way, but it's also been like music that I go to. Like, even before we met just now, I was listening to it was another recording of hers, not from the ashram, but sometimes I listen to her for like spiritual, like grounding or just being in touch. And so I have this very deep connection. After staying at the ashram, it just increased because I met a lot of the people who were her spiritual students. So it's like thinking of her as a musician, but she's also a spiritual leader. And so hearing about what she was like, and I don't know, it's just been, so I just find like, I had this project in mind when I visited the ashram to write a scholarly article on her process as a composer. And that's what it started out as. But then once I got there, it just was so deep of an experience that I didn't really know where to start with that particular article. And I find that learning about her has been, it took another form. It's just been like a part of every like project I've done. There's some sort of inspiration from Alice Coltrane. So she's kind of like a thread, you know.
When you came and did the concert with Brandy at the Cleveland Museum of Art, as I mentioned, a lot of that maybe more than half the program was music of Alice Coltrane. But I recall that both you and Brandy were telling me that at least some of that music was her unreleased private music or ritual music from the ashram, not the records that we know from the early 70s, which have all been re-released and I think in some ways brought a new light to Alice Coltrane's musical life as records are circulating. But this other kind of almost hidden material that you wouldn't have known, I wouldn't have known about it unless I had been either in the ashram or studying directly with her. How did that music, which you know much more about, how did that come to the surface?
Well, at that time, so that's a good point you mentioned, because when we did the concert at Cleveland Museum, they hadn't yet re-released some of this music. So since then, they have put out an album that's like a compilation of the music she did during that time period. But she did at least four recordings that were, they weren't like done through a record label like her earlier works have been. It was things that you can find at the ashram. You also could find it online at certain sites. I'm trying to remember what site I went to, but I remember downloading, there's books that Alice Coltrane wrote, Divine Revelations, Endless Wisdom, Monument Eternal. There's these different books that she wrote that you could find them on special websites, but it wasn't easy to find at the time. But the way I was introduced was there was a clip from one of those, someone recorded the actual cassette tape and put it on YouTube. So I was listening to other Alice Coltrane and I came upon one of her chant music pieces and I was just blown out. I'm trying to remember which one it was, but it was from one of the albums. And so that's how I got introduced. Then I just started searching for them, and some were on YouTube, but some were like other sites. And then so at the time we performed it, those things were not released, had not been re-released yet. But since then, there's been a sort of a resurgence. And it also happened around the time when the ashram was closed. So it's like the ashram itself closed because people stayed living there. Alice Coltrane died in 2007, but people were living there who had been there since the 80s with her and like raised their families and everything. They stayed there until recently. But now that the ashram's closed, they also have been carrying this music other places. So that's been interesting. It's like the life of the ashram continues in a different way.
But that concert that you brought to us in Cleveland was not only Alice's music, it was your own music too. And I don't really remember the details of how you and Brandy put the program together, but I wanted to ask you very particularly, there's one piece on that concert which still resonates with me, a piece of yours called Spirits.
Yeah,
Can you tell me about that piece?
So it actually came out of a piece I mentioned earlier, Prophetica, an oratorio. That's the one, it was with Charlotte Brathwaite and artist Abigail DeVille. So we created this piece that was inspired by Sun Ra, Alice Coltrane, and Harriet Tubman. And Brandy was a musician on that project, was a collaborator, Jadelle McPherson, Justin Hicks. So we had a whole team that we were doing that project. And one of the pieces I created for the beginning of it was kind of like a summoning or like bringing like it's like setting the mood for the place. It was that piece that became Spirits later. But out of context, once it was part of that larger piece, but I just kind of after that used it as its own piece that I would perform, that I still perform it. I perform it when I'm doing live concerts, kind of in the spirit of the way Billie Holiday performed Strange Fruit. And inspired by that, I would use that piece, Spirits, where I would quote, there's a quotation of Alice Coltrane quoting John Coltrane in her in one of her recordings where it's, may there be peace and love and perfection throughout all creation, oh God.
Throughout all creation, oh God.
So I start with that chant, and then the piece goes through, it's kind of like a light rain to a rainstorm to a storm. And at the end, I always read the names of victims of police brutality. And unfortunately, each time I perform it, there were different names to add. But what I would try to do is just mention some that were in my mind and speak their names. So I speak it while I'm playing and really just try to honor the spirits of their spirits. and try to balance it between men and women and others and children and adults and
Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Freddie Gray, Tamir Rice.
It came back to me, and probably anybody who knows the piece came back right now, crashing back into reality in this moment that we're living in. 3 years later, there have been names added to that list. And the disaster of what's happening in the American landscape right now. Have you played that piece during this moment of turbulence in America, or have you thought? I'm sure you've thought about it in this context.
yeah, I at the academy there are times I think I played it in some setting, but it was a very private setting. Since I've come home, I haven't done a live performance. I did one performance at a piano for a series called Letters from the Porch that was put together by two artists, Free For All and Jebby Lewis here in New Orleans. So I performed some music on that. I didn't include that one. But another series that was by the Musical Arts Society of New Orleans, they were putting together living room concerts of different classical pianists from different places that were affiliated with the organization. And they invited me along with that to contribute something. And so since I wasn't at a piano, I sent that piece, the video that I have online of Spirits. And so they used that as part of their series during this time. And you know, it did actually this was before the start of the recent rebellion. So at the time, I mean, the thing is, these things have continued happening. It's just that as we see, it's kind of come to a head again, and people are also saying enough is enough.
Right.
So, but when we featured this during this time, it was before Ahmaud Arbery and before George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So yeah, I mean, but what's happening now is besides that piece that I perform, like with the opera as we're collaborating, what's going on right now, especially less with the actual killings that happen, but more with the responses of people, like the protests and the push to find some solution to policing in America and some approaches to racial injustice. There's so many things that need to be improved greatly. That inspiration is going into this work we're doing, and what's helpful is to look at these women from the past. The other inspirations I mentioned Rebecca Cox Jackson, but it's Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. And so sometimes it's like when you're looking to the dreaming of the better future, it's also helpful to look in the past and see what other freedom fighters and abolitionists have done in these earlier times.
How do you mean in terms of just meditating on their experiences or their words, or for inspiration, or how do you mean?
Yeah, I think a mix, just like for me learning, just like it always has a different context to me when I can just learn more history. So even if I have an idea of who Harriet Tubman was, like the more I learn about the things she did, and more like numbers, like, just like, or just more biography wise, it just has a different appreciation. I think also for this longer freedom struggle, this freedom struggle has been going on for a while and there's been progress made, but there's some things that we could call progress, and there's other things that have been like an underlying thing that's been for a long time. And so when we're dealing with race in this country, I don't know, it's just such a complicated issue for me. And I just like to learn more about different historical figures, just to understand where we are. But also as an artist, there is the inspiration side. It's not like, oh, I want to just pull on this for like, so I can get a melody. So it's not like so not just to extract inspiration, but it is like, to me, it's like it's a more full understanding of where we are, where we're trying to go, if we can understand where we've been, basically.